Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Lunch with California Common Cause, our weekly opportunity for us to chat with our members and others interested in building a better and more inclusive California democracy. I'm Jonathan Stein, the Executive Director at California Common Cause. We're coming to you in a slightly different way this week. We couldn't make the Zoom Facebook integration work, so our live stream, our weekly Wednesday at noon live stream, didn't work the way that we had hoped it would, but we recorded today's conversation with the fabulous Kathay Feng to bring it to you in a delayed fashion, so you can watch it at your leisure. We're now less than 2 months from Election Day. I hope you're out there being involved in whichever way works best for you: phone banking, text banking, organizing ballot parties, getting educated about ballot propositions, donating to candidates, and so on and so on. There's a total flurry of activity right now, and I hope you're finding the way for you that scratches your itch, or that reduces your panic, or whatever it is that you need to do to feel effective and solutions-oriented in our democracy right now. Today we're going to talk with Kathay Feng, National Redistricting Director at Common Cause. She was the Executive Director at California Common Cause for over 10 years, meaning she's my predecessor. She's the shoes I'm trying to fill. In addition to a long litany of incredible policy reforms that occurred in California when Kathay was Executive Director of California Common Cause, including online voter registration, automatic voter registration, and a whole number of others, Kathay was responsible for the creation, or as responsible as anyone in California, for the creation of the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, which is a best practice, gold standard across the country. And today, Kathay, in her new role as the National Redistricting Director at Common Cause, is working to spread that gold standard in other states around the country. So I'm going to ask our staff to bring Kathay's video up. We'll talk to her about, hi Kathay, we're going to talk to her about redistricting. But first, we have to talk about litigation, because you cannot run an election in this country anymore without litigation left, right, and center. And so let's talk, Kathay, about at least 3 lawsuits. And then if we feel like we've got the legal stuff covered, I want to ask you about your experience, your long experience on redistricting. Okay.
Sure.
Two major areas in which there are lawsuits around the census. Okay, so first, can you tell us about the lawsuits that are currently ongoing around census timing? So, as I'm sure you will explain, the Census Bureau had indicated that it very much needed a delay in its timeline. The Trump administration seemed to endorse that, then decided to reverse course and rush the timeline, resulting in a flurry of lawsuits. Tell us about those lawsuits. Give us the background and tell us why they're important.
It's a little complicated, so I'll try to start from the beginning. And that is that for about 70 years now, we have run the census like clockwork because of a congressional statute that has existed for many, many decades. What happened used to be was that, remember, April 1st used to be Census Day, and that was the day that most people would receive their form in the mail, and they would open it up and they would respond. Well, this year we did it a little differently. Already it was planned to be online, but April 1st was Census Day. And from that moment on, they sort of counted out that they needed, from Census Day, another 5 months to complete everything. And their hope was that a lot of people would reply online, but they had expected that they were going to have a certain number of months towards the tail end where they're actually going and knocking on people's doors, or phone calling them and just making sure that, hey, we didn't hear from this household, would you like to fill out the census form? What happened was that, obviously, in the middle of that, here comes COVID. And lots of states are shutting down for absolutely legitimate reasons, right? The Census Bureau said in March, we also need to shut down. So they shut down all of their field offices for 3 months, March, April, May, right on top of Census Day, right? And presumably also the time when they would have started, ramping up all of the efforts to figure out which households haven't responded and start knocking on doors. Besides the Census Bureau, there's a whole host of nonprofits, government agencies. I know my local library was ready to gear up. Everybody was gearing up to encourage everyone to respond. But instead, we've all been living in this wholly different situation where you've got to stay at home, don't go out, and so for on some levels, what's happened is that a lot of people have, in fact, responded online, which is good, right? But the problem is that the Census Bureau was not able to reactivate their field operations until July, June and July. And so in delaying for essentially 3 months, the process of getting out there, what's now happening is they only have a few more months to go. And all the things that they originally were planning on doing, they said, okay, well, since we closed down for that number of months, we need to add that extra 5 months all the way to the end. So originally what they said was, okay, so that plus 5 months equals October 31st. We're going to go until October 31st. We're going to count, we're going to reactivate everything, and we're going to extend it by a couple months. Everybody agreed. We were all sort of like, oh, what's that going to do for redistricting? It does create some challenges, but the reality was that everybody was ready to go, including the administration. Then I think somebody in the administration figured out, wait a second, if you delay the counting of census all the way until October 31st, that will make it very difficult for the Census Bureau to actually turn over the data to the president and to Congress to begin the very first step of what we usually do with the census numbers, which is to reapportion. Reapportion is the process where you say California has 3.45 million people, and Minnesota has something else. And so basically, based on all the different states' population, total population, we're now going to determine how many seats you get in the House of Representatives. And that first step used to happen on December 31st. It would have happened this year, December 31st, 2020, except for COVID. And so everybody said, well, if you've got to delay the census operations by 3 months, then why not also push that deadline out by 3 months, which would mean census wouldn't have to turn over the data until March of 2021. That would be fine if we weren't living in a crazy world where people view even something as universally widely accepted as the census into something that is a partisan weapon. And because the administration views the census as something that can be politicized, they said, well, we don't know what's going to happen after the election. We don't know if this administration is still going to be around after December or after January 20th. And so they said, we refuse to change that December 31st date, which then forced the census to reevaluate whether they could keep counting all the way up until October 31st. Big problem with that is we're now in September, and we've got huge patches of people who have not been counted, right? In California, it's not just that our state has only counted about 65% of the people, which means 45% haven't been counted. It's also that in some communities, when you zoom in to a place, you can find that literally 75% of the people have not been counted. So 1 out of 4 have been, 3 out of 4 haven't. That's huge, because when you're missing millions of people from a state, not only are you potentially losing congressional representation, you are also distorting how redistricting will be drawn, and the money that's so necessary to come to communities to help support them, from everything from building new roads to where are we going to invest in a hospital, or how are we going to make sure that enough PPEs get to that hospital, are determined by census. And if the communities that are least likely to have responded yet are the ones that have the greatest need, we know that BIPOC communities are the ones where that's where that big gap is. And that big gap will mean that those communities get hit the hardest when it comes to determining resources and representation. So we sued. And our friends at the Lawyers Committee, representing National Urban League and many other partner organizations, pushed to make sure that Census could not cut off its counting process so early. It had to go all the way until October 31st. There was a decision that happened just over Labor Day weekend where Judge Lucy Coe from California determined that there was enough of a question at hand that she was going to stop the Census Bureau from cutting any more staff, laying off any more people. They had to keep proceeding until they have a hearing on September 17th. If on September 17th, when they determine if there's enough of a case here, the judge decides, you're right, you got to keep going, you can't just cut it off at September 30th, then we're back in play in terms of whether or not the census will do a good job, a better job at least, of counting 100% of everybody.
You mentioned that an undercount in the census distorts how we do redistricting, and I just want to dig into that for just a second.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So let's say, as an example, right, low-income communities of color in, I'm going to take a hypothetical, Fresno, are undercounted at really dramatic rates. But communities with, let's say, higher levels of education, greater wealth, et cetera, in the Bay Area are responding at higher rates. What that's going to mean when California does its redistricting is that you may have, let's say, 100,000 people represented in the census, 100,000 people counted in a Fresno Assembly District, these are hypothetical numbers, and 100,000 people counted in, let's say, a San Francisco Assembly District. Because San Francisco got counted appropriately, there might actually be 100,000 people in that district. But in Fresno, because there was an undercount, that district that has 100,000 people might actually have 150,000 people because 50,000 people in Fresno weren't counted, right? And so what that means is you lose the one person, one vote principle, or you lose this idea of equal representation. You have districts in which communities that participated in census at lower rates are crammed into districts, and they have effectively less representation than other folks. So I don't know, Kathy, if you want to talk.
And besides representation, everything else that our government does is based on census numbers. So allocations of school funding, allocations of road funding. There are lots of grants to local fire departments that determine whether or not they get the fire trucks and the equipment that they get, right? Both the state and the federal government use census data. And beyond that, even our businesses use census data to determine whether or not you're going to put another cell phone tower in a certain place because your population has grown enough. And if you don't see that 50,000 people in Fresno that got not counted, that may be the determination that we don't need another road there and another cell phone tower there and another school there, right? Those are huge things that a community then loses out on. It may lead to the reason why a hospital, despite the fact that they feel like they're overloaded, there's some kind of outside determination that they're not going to get a grant, and so they can't keep operating in that place. And we've seen a lot of hospitals and other services that serve rural communities or otherwise underserved communities have to shut down. And census numbers are so critical to determining whether or not we keep or shut something down.
And I just want to wrap on this subject by saying that counting everybody is an apolitical priority. And it is for, almost every American. It is a good thing to count everyone so that every community gets political representation and resources in accordance with their size. And unfortunately, it looks like the census and the Census Bureau is being politicized by the Trump administration, but this should be something supported by a full count of everyone should be supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. I want to move to another piece of census litigation, which is a case that Common Cause is involved with to ensure that undocumented folks are counted in the census. Can you explain why it's important? Well, first of all, I think it's legally necessary legally required by the Constitution to count everyone, including folks who are undocumented. But can you explain a little bit about the case and why it's important that we count everyone? Right.
Well, first of all, the Constitution says so. So period. If everybody, for those folks who care deeply about, being constitutional, there's no argument. It talks about enumeration of every person. The second is that after the Civil War, when we passed the 14th Amendment, we specifically said every person means every person, right? We're not excluding some classes of people. We're not counting some people as 3/5. We're counting everybody as one person, right? And then subsequently, you know, over the 1920s and 30s, there have been active debates. Are we counting new immigrants? Are we, you know, back then that was Eastern Europeans, some Asian groups, right? And while there may have been fierce conversations about whether or not we should close or open our doors for immigration, in the end, Congress consistently, decade after decade, has determined that when we count everyone. In fact, even in the most recent presidential administrations, whether that's Reagan, Carter, Bush 1, Bush 2, Obama, right? Everybody has unanimously agreed that you count everyone. And in fact, actually, every single one of those administrations has been asked the question, are we counting everyone? And the DOJ has consistently, under every single one of those presidential administrations, said, yes, we count everyone, including the Bush administration where previously William Barr was an AG and determined that this was something that you were going to do, you're going to count everyone. So it's been consistent in the U.S. Constitution, it's been consistent in our history, and it's consistent in how our presidential application of the census implementation is going to be for the last many, many decades. So the question is, why do we change that rule now? And I think one of the things that our Common Cause viewers know very well is that a piece of this was revealed when, in our North Carolina case, we came across a trove of documents that came from Stephanie Hoffler, the daughter of former GOP redistricting strategist Thomas Hoffler.
Gerrymandering guru.
Yes, this is a man who literally parachuted in to different states, drew the lines behind closed doors, handed it to Republican-controlled legislatures or governors, and said, these are the lines that you want if you want to cement control for the rest of the decade. Setting that aside, because both parties try to do that, he was just very effective. He had a memo in 2015 where he analyzed precinct by precinct Texas, and he said, you know what? We don't do this right now. Right now we count everybody. But if only we could exclude people who are non-citizens, we would actually exclude a lot of Latinos, and we know that that would piss them off. And we know that that would violate the one person, one vote rule. He says this in his memo. But if we were to do that, that would be, in his words, quote, advantageous to Republicans and non-Hispanic whites. His words. So this became a strategy that wasn't just crazy Thomas Hoffler. Thomas Hoffler headed up the redistricting strategy for the entire Republican Party. He was actively talking to people in the Trump administration, and in particular to senior level officials within the Census Bureau. We know this because when all those documents came over to us in the North Carolina litigation, some of those documents revealed communications directly, emails back and forth with Census Bureau officials. And there was an effort, a coordinated effort, to start introducing this idea. What could we do to start capturing information about who is a citizen and who is a non-citizen? The first time we saw that was when they tried to introduce, out of the blue, this idea of adding a citizenship question. Because of the Hoffler documents and many other pieces of evidence, the Supreme Court said, stop, that's illegal. You don't seem to be really trying to do this to protect voting rights of minorities, so we're going to stop you. The Trump administration came up with the second thing. Let's issue an executive order to demand everybody give us data from other administrative agencies. And now this is their third attempt. Their third attempt, which is a memo to say, once we get the data from the Census Bureau, we're going to just do the cleansing on our own. How that cleansing happens, what basis they're going to make a decision on who's documented and who's not, is going to be entirely in a little black box. And when you think about it, for those of us who come from immigrant families, what I know is you can have a family that lives in one household where some people are documented, some people are not. Some people might be even citizens and some people are not. Through marriage, through childbirth, through an aunt who finally achieved citizenship because she passed the exam, and then somebody else who's still on their path. You can have people who are in limbo. They're here legally, but they're sitting and waiting to see if they're going to get temporary protected status or asylum status or any other kind of determination. Who's going to determine whether somebody who's in limbo should be removed from the census? And then what do you do if the uncle is that way, but not the aunt? Do you eliminate the entire household? This is where this strategy really goes back to what are they really trying to do? And if what they're really trying to do is erase a group of people in order to have a partisan and racial advantage, then that is fundamentally illegal and unconstitutional.
Right. And we're bringing a lawsuit to stop it.
And we're bringing a lawsuit to stop it.
Right. Okay, so let me talk about a third lawsuit. This one's not about census. In any given election year, we've got lots of election litigation, but in this particular year, we've got election and census litigation. So it's just, like it's all over the place.
Crazy town.
Let's talk about the USPS lawsuit. So another lawsuit that Common Cause is part of. The Trump administration was, everybody saw this, was covered very dramatically in the news, shutting down various USPS services, making changes to personnel protocols and other internal practices that seemed very obviously to result in a delay in the mail. This was occurring in the same year as an election in which we are going to see more mail ballots than any other in American history, I think almost certainly. And so there was real question over why is a major Trump donor who is newly appointed as the head of USPS immediately making changes that throws the integrity of our elections into jeopardy. Common Cause is suing in order to stop some of those changes so that we can get through the November election with people having confidence in voting by mail. Can you tell us a little bit about that lawsuit? Yeah,
so folks will remember that not so many weeks ago, right, middle of August, all of a sudden we started hearing news, and I think a lot of us were feeling this already. The mail seemed to be slow to come, right? And what we found out was that as soon as the Joy got into office, what he started doing was he accelerated orders to do 4 or 5 things. One was to demand that postal workers not exercise discretion to stay late in order to ensure that a delivery got onto a truck to make it out to, the last night's delivery. So his justification was on cutting overtime. But what that meant was that once you sort of miss one link in the chain where a bundle of things don't make it onto a truck, that then makes it onto a train, that then makes it onto a plane, right? There's a number of ways that can slow down the entire chain of deliveries. And if you think about that, around Election Day, where for many states like California, we have determined that you can mail your ballot on Election Day as long as it's postmarked, but it still has to arrive by a certain day. If all of a sudden the delay in making it from the post office box to the central distribution center to the, eventually your county registrar means that several days are added, that could make the difference of whether those ballots are counted or not. Okay. We also know that they started removing the little blue post office mailboxes. For many communities, particularly in rural communities, that's their only way of kind of depositing something to ensure that the postal worker can pick it up. So when you remove that, that's like a whole community that you're essentially taking off of the grid. Many urban communities, the same thing. If you don't have a house where there's a postal worker who's picking up the mail from your mailbox, you got to depend on that little blue box. Third thing, crazily enough, they were starting to remove the sorting machines that were in local distribution centers, right? And these sorting machines sort through thousands of pieces of mail so that it can determine like which, 4-digit zip it needs to go to. You can't do that by hand. And his justification was there are more packages coming along. But what we also know is that once the voting by mail ballots hit the mail, those are not going to be packages. Those are going to be little envelopes that have all your important information in it. So if you slow that down, you're really slowing down the entire election process. So there are so many things that were happening right around the middle of August that were slowing everything to a halt that everyone said, time to scream bloody murder. For Common Cause, we joined with a number of nonprofit organizations, including League of Women Voters, Lawyers Committee, National Urban League, and we said we're going to file a lawsuit to stop this. There were several states led by Pennsylvania, one suit, and another suit led by Washington that did the same. Literally in that 1 week, on the 18th, multiple lawsuits were brought, and then that Friday, so this is like Tuesday, Wednesday, that Friday, Congress hauled the Joy into a hearing, asked him to explain himself, and he backed down and said, okay, I'm not going to implement any more of these plans. What's still in question is, but what about all the sorting machines you've already trashed and not only just taken offline, but literally ordered people to start disassembling? This is where I will say a lot of postal workers who care deeply about their job and doing it well and doing it right became the whistleblowers who said, what's going on? My job's already hard enough as it is, and you're going to take this sorting machine offline and literally start to disassemble it so that we can't use it anymore? Clearly something was going on. So any additional changes have been stopped, we believe, until the elections happen. But in the meantime, we still have an ongoing lawsuit to make sure that what damage was done can be undone. And more importantly, also, we're working through Congress to make sure that a bill is introduced. And we believe that there's a bipartisan bill that could make it through the Senate that's sponsored by Senator Schatz from Hawaii, Democrat, and Senator Murkowski, Republican from Alaska, to give about $25 billion to the Postal Service to ensure that the upgrades that we need or the restoration of the damaged goods that were made can happen, and that we have a very smooth election through November. Nobody wants to see us go down in flames. And I'm hoping that, like the census, we take the partisanship and the politicization out, and we say this is just the right thing to do. We've always been a beacon of democracy for other places. And now we're starting to become a laughing joke. And so if we don't invest in our own elections and do as we say, I think we have to question what's happened to sort of the thing that we have held up as a model for the rest of the world.
Yeah, 2020 has been a year, at least certainly here in California and around the nation, in which we've really, what's the right way to put this? Our heroes, everyday heroes have really stepped forward. Firefighters who are fighting massive blazes, right? Teachers who are trying to work their way through and adjust to distance learning, and postal workers. And all of a sudden we're like, oh, right, our whole democracy depends on these people being able to do their jobs.
Yeah.
And thank God that
I hope people, when you see your postal worker, you show them some love. You give them a wave, give them a thank you. That's the USPS, it's the UPS, it's all those people who are still doing their very hard jobs in these trying times. They don't need another layer of damage done by political interests.
Yeah, and I'll just say in California, so we've taken steps to ensure that people can return their ballot if there are problems with USPS. First and foremost, if you get your ballot in the mail by Election Day, if it's postmarked by Election Day, now FYI, don't put your ballot in a blue box at 7 p.m. on Election Day, okay? Make sure that, I'm telling the viewers this, Kathy, not you, make sure that you have it postmarked by Election Day. If it's postmarked by Election Day, it has 17 days to get to the elections office and it will still be counted. It used to be 3.
And that's a new rule. It's giving extra time, which is fantastic.
Right, and in the rest of the nation, 3 is considered a pretty good standard, but in California, we have 17 days. And if you don't want to use vote by mail at all, you can take your vote by mail ballot and you can drop it off at any voting site in your community. It doesn't have to be the polling place nearest your home. It can be any voting site in your county. Or you can use a ballot drop box, which is a drop box operated by your county elections office. Okay, we promised the viewers, Kathy, just a little bit about redistricting. I know I've used a lot of your time already. I'll just ask you, I guess, one question about redistricting. You were intimately involved in creation of the Citizens Redistricting Commission in California, which was a smashing success 10 years ago and really became the nationwide best practice for ensuring inclusive, citizen-run, independent redistricting. And it's being recreated now around the country and in cities and counties around California. while everyone sort of is cheerleading this thing, or most people are cheerleading this thing now, as we create the second ever Citizens Redistricting Commission, when it was created, it was opposed by the state's Democratic Party. It was opposed by the state's Republican Party. It was a relatively untested and unproven idea. And so I guess my question to you is, how hard was it exactly? How did you push past all of that resistance in order to make this thing happen?
Right. I will say that part of the determination came from the real lived experience of 2001, when I went through the redistricting process when it was done by the legislature. And at that time, I worked for the Asian American, what is now the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Los Angeles, and sister organization to the organization that you came from in San Francisco. And one of the things that we did was to organize communities up and down the state to first fill out their census form, and then to learn about this crazy thing called redistricting and tell the story of their communities. And what we found was, it was very empowering for people. Well, a lot of people, they'd never appeared before a governmental body, and certainly not to tell the story of their community. And, tears were shed, sort of this catharsis of feeling like they were heard. But what they found out was that after 4 months of hearings by the Assembly and Senate, that these electeds went behind closed doors and orchestrated a gerrymander behind closed doors, no public input, did what they needed to do. And in a lot of cases, our communities were sliced and diced, traded as pawns on a board, right? I got a phone call from a particular legislator in San Francisco. And because we'd been organizing in San Francisco, she was concerned, and I thought it was a positive call. I thought she was going to call me to say, I heard what you said. It was really touching to hear all those stories. Sure, we'll do that. Instead, what she said was, Kathy, you're not going to put another fucking Asian in my district. 2001. San Francisco, kind of hard to move a line without accidentally putting an effing agent in her district. But that's what she said. And that was the kind of arrogance that existed. And she's not the only one. She's just the one that I tell the story of because she's no longer in office. Plenty of people exercise exactly that kind of attitude towards minorities, whether whoever was the up and coming community that might challenge or vote differently, or she didn't know, they were going to be cut out or cut up, right? And it happened again and again. And what I decided was, if we're going to do this in a way that lives up to all of the organizing that people put in to kind of bring people to hearings, what we need to do is something where it is really grassroots up, where the community's voices actually are heard, and ultimately the people who are making decisions don't have a conflict of interest. Problem is that that's really scary for the party in power, right? So we had a lot of folks who now, you ask Nancy Pelosi how she feels about redistricting reform, and she's like, it's the number one thing. I'm going to put it in HR 1, the first bill that we introduced, as soon as I retook power. But back then in 2008, she was actively calling people who had already endorsed the initiative to get them to back off, including NAACP, right? Including ACLU. So the reality was that the powers that be did not want this change. And sometimes it's just a lack of control, right? And sometimes it's because the particular people who a district was carved out for, even if it was a Democrat, was the friend who supported my speakership, or the friend who I had cultivated something so they owe me something, right? The committee assignment. And really what ended up happening was, once you drew the lines with the commission listening to communities, then instead of looking backwards at where your old constituencies were, or crazy things like I need to draw a line to a horse stable because I feel like it and I have that power and that's where my horses are.
That's a real example for the record. It's crazy. True story, right? That instead they had to listen to those community testimony that told them, where are communities growing? How are we changing, right? This was, at that time, more and more people were moving inland because housing prices were getting so out of control that, people were finding sort of a better ability to purchase or rent in further east. And so if you didn't start redrawing districts that reflected where those population growths were, you were missing out on
on a lot of kind of growing communities. That 2011 process, the first time it happened, we saw a remap of the entire state where, for the first time, it really reflected where communities were growing and how we were changing, and not just sort of a look back. And, you know, when it was all said and done, voters do what they do, people do what they do, and it turns out that the Democratic Party, if they actually compete on a level playing field, they stood a fighting chance of winning, as do Republicans. And then it's an even fight, right? You fight for the ideals of your party, and you duke it out for the best candidate. And that conversation, the exciting part was, sometimes it was Democrat between Democrats, sometimes it was Democrat versus Republican, sometimes it was Republican versus Republican because of our top two systems. But what happened was that the elections, for the first time, you had candidates who had to duke it out. They had to earn people's votes. They had to show up for debates. They had to go to, as I like to say, in the Berman district, for the first time you saw Berman and Sherman showing up to every single bat mitzvah and baseball game. And they were like busy handing out, little flyers and whatnot. It was the first time that some of these congressional members had come back to their district to fight for an election and earn people's right and share what they've been doing, right? And then voters made a choice. And I think that for a lot of voters, it reconnected them to the people that they elect to represent them wherever they are, Sacramento or DC. That's very, very important. And so I think that it's revitalized the process of elections to sort of make it, there are elections where there's actually a stake. It's not just a gimme that somebody's going to win either the primary or the general election. And the last piece is just that when we saw the hearings and the application process, when we were first imagining it, we actually did some calculations to think about like how many people might apply. And in our wildest dreams, we're like, maybe 600 people will apply, and we'll have, we'll be able to pick, some talented group of people. On day one, when they opened up the application process, 600 people applied. And by the end of the process, something like 30,000 people had put their name into the hat. And the good news is that, when it was all said and done and it got whittled down, what that meant when you had these huge numbers is you have a real talent pool. I mean, this is like picking the best of the best, whether it's your NBA, ideal basketball team or your incoming class of freshmen or whatever that is, but you're really choosing like the best of the best in California. And those first 14 people represented the diversity, the thoughtfulness, the creativity, the different geographies of California. It was very exciting. Now, those 14 people still are so excited about redistricting that they become they geek out on everything. They have been awarded by Harvard for really generating a whole new level of civic participation. And so they traveled around the country and told their story, which is not coincidental because then in 2018, 5 states went to the ballot: Michigan, Ohio, Missouri, Colorado, Utah, and they all passed redistricting reform. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that California showed it's not impossible and it's actually a good idea.
Yeah, red states and blue states.
Red states and blue states.
Independent
very purple states too.
Yeah, that's right.
It's very exciting. Michigan is going to be implementing it for the first time, and it's got a system that's very similar to us. And imagine if Michigan, we all know that this is a state that is a battleground state. Ohio, battleground state. Missouri, Colorado, these are all states where they are states that both parties have invested a lot of effort into trying to win. And if the system is open and truly lets people vote and choose, whether it's in the primary or general elections, because there's now a true choice in the elections, you're going to see very vibrant elections where turnout will be heightened and where I think that people have a renewed trust in their government, which ultimately that's what this is about, right? We need to stop having such a cynical approach to everything, because if you don't trust anything and you don't sort of invest in these institutions, you might as well just walk away.
Right. Well, Kathay, thank you for all of that work 10 plus years ago, and for your quest to take that model across the country. We're incredibly indebted to you here in California. And I really do appreciate you spending an hour with us to talk about all this critically important.
And if I may, I know that you're shining a spotlight on me, but here's the thing. You took over in 2020, one of the craziest years ever. You took over at a time when literally we had just gone into shutdown, which who knew what that was going to be? And then you got on to what felt like 13 hours of calls every day to basically figure out what is California going to do in terms of running our elections in this whole new COVID world. And at the time, remember in May or whatever, we didn't know if we were going to be done in June and, you know, everything solved, or maybe we're going to go all the way until November. And it looks like we're going to go all the way until November. And that was before we were litigating around census and redistricting and the U.S. Postal Service and a million other things. So what I'll say is that I want to thank you for keeping the ship steady in this crazy storm. And you've been hit by about 25 storms so far. It's not easy. And I think it's really reassuring to a lot of people to know that Common Cause, you know, wherever the battle is, that we're holding that banner high for people to make sure that our democracy remains inclusive, that we keep, you know, we keep pushing this question, how can we make sure that more people are included and that more voices are heard? You're doing it, Jonathan.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate it. I'm just keeping your torch lit in the storm, I think. Thank you for joining us. To everyone out there, please stay safe, not just with the quarantine, but with the fires. The sky is orange outside my window today. I'm sure it's some nasty color outside yours, wherever you are. So
yeah.
I hope you're able to get
Southern
some
California, we're covered with ash.
Yeah, good luck. I hope you find some clean air and some decent weather. Thank you for joining us and for hanging out to talk democracy for an hour with us. Follow us on Twitter at Common Cause CA. Follow us on Instagram at CA Common Cause. You can follow me on Twitter at _Jonathan Stein. Kathy, do you want to shout out your Twitter handle?
Oh
boy.
Kathay, KATHAYCCC. I think that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Or we'll put it up. We'll post it in the comments or something. Next week, I think it'll just be me solo. A week after that, our plan is to meet with organizers behind a ballot measure in November that would extend, if passed, would extend the right to vote to Californians on parole. So we're going to talk about the interaction of voting in democracy and the criminal justice system. And we'll be talking with somebody from the ACLU and somebody, this is on the 23rd, somebody at the ACLU and somebody who's been through the criminal justice system and fighting for his right to vote. And then the week after that, our hope, fingers crossed, is that we'll be joined by a state senator who's been a leader for the last decade on democracy reform. So lots of exciting things to come in September from us here at Lunch with California Common Cause. As always, we appreciate you and we appreciate your support of California Common Cause. Thanks for being with us in the fight. We will see you next week.
Bye.